what I've become. These hands are dirty. I dare not lift them up to the Holy One. You plead my cause, you right my wrongs, you break my chains, you overcome. You gave your life to give me mine. You say that I am free. How can it be? Yeah. How can it be? I've been hiding, afraid I let you down. Inside I doubt that you still love me, but in your eyes there's only grace now. You plead my cause, you right my wrongs, you break my chains, you overcome. You gave your life to give me mine. You say that I am free. How can it be? Yeah. How can it be? Yeah. Though I fall, you can make me new. From this death I will rise with you. Oh, the grace reaching out for me. Yeah. How can it be? How can it be? You plead my cause, you right my wrongs, you break my chains, you overcome. You gave your life to give me mine. You say that I am free. How can it be? You plead my cause, you right my wrongs, you break my chains, you overcome.
Early, on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter, who was behind him, arrived and went into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the burial cloth that had been around Jesus' head. The cloth was folded up by itself, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went inside. He saw and believed. They still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. It is Easter or Resurrection Sunday today, where we remember the event that changed history, the event that gave us a future. When, soon after Sabbath had broken, Mary had gone back to the tomb, she went there to finish preparing the body, to finish what had been started with the spices. But when she arrived, to her surprise, the tomb was open and empty. Well, nearly empty. John and Peter would go inside and find something that remained. Over the course of the last 5 weeks of Lent, we have been in a series called The Clothes That Jesus Wore. We looked at Jesus' everyday garments, the ones that the soldiers at the foot of the cross were dividing out between them and gambling for. We remembered and recalled his sandals and the outer tunic. We also talked about the head covering and the girdle or the belts. We spent quite a bit of time on the seamless garment, the one that was woven of one piece of cloth, the valuable garment. And we looked back at the Old Testament and saw the description of how the high priest had a seamless woven garment that he was to wear. And we made some possible connections. We looked at the garments that the soldiers dressed Jesus in for laughs and kicks. The scarlet robe, the crown of thorns, the stick that they mockingly used as a scepter that a ruler would have and put in his hand. But what the men did jokingly, we saw God took very seriously. This was indeed Jesus' coronation. This was the way that he came into his throne. But we had gone back in the first week even further. And we looked at the clothes that first adorned Jesus' body, the swaddling cloths that Mary had wrapped him in when he had come forth from the womb, and that she then laid him in a manger, a stone manger. And we reminisced about how this first act eerily reminds us of the last act of Jesus' life and death, when Jesus would be wrapped in a linen shroud and laid in a stone tomb. Which brings us to the last set of earthly clothes that Jesus wore, the grave clothes. In John's account of the empty tomb, Mary finds the tomb void. There is no body in it. She rushes back and tells the disciples, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." Her first assumption is that the Roman soldiers had relocated Jesus' body. Craig Keener explains, saying, "The authorities would have sometimes deposited the bodies of the executed in group graves, designated for criminals, handing them over only after a year." Peter and John hear this and they race to the tomb. And we know it's a race because John lets you know who wins. Not Peter, but the other one. Now, John doesn't use his name, but we know he's talking about himself because this is kind of a common first century way of writing about oneself in the third person. So earlier, when he referenced the disciple that Jesus loved, guess who he's talking about? Yours truly. He goes on to admit that he didn't enter the tomb right away. Though he had gotten there first, Peter was the first to go inside. Now let's stop for a minute and talk about the tomb of Jesus. It is believed that we know where the location of that tomb was. And you can visit it even today. And when you do visit it, what you're going to find on that site is the historical church known as the Holy Sepulchre. Here's a picture of the Holy Sepulchre. This is the main courtyard and what has become the main doors that you go inside if you're visiting to see all the sights, the smells, the sounds. Now, this site in 325 AD is where the Roman Emperor Constantine's mother, Helena, who by the way was a devout Christian, went to Jerusalem to seek the location of Jesus, his tomb. Now, since pilgrims had been visiting this spot for years and years, when she arrived there, the locals knew exactly where to show her. Now, it was in a location just outside the city walls. Here's a picture we looked at last week, which shows the path of Jesus from the time of his arrest on the Mount of Olives, just on the other side of the Kidron Valley. And he was taken into the old city, or first century Jerusalem. And he was brought first to the high priest's place, where he was interrogated. And then he was sent across to the Praetorium, or Herod the Great's palace, number 3 and 5. He was sent from number 3 back over to Herod Antipas, Herod the Great's son, who was in town for the Passover, but had no jurisdiction there. He was an overseer or governor of the Galilee region where Jesus was from, Nazareth. Herod Antipas sends him back over to Herod's palace, where Pontius Pilate is, and from there he goes out to number 6, where the cross is, just outside the city walls of that time, where you'll find the Holy Sepulchre today. Now, when Helena visits, what does she discover when she arrives? Well, not a church, because that church wasn't there yet. But she did find something odd to our eyes, and that is the Temple of Aphrodite. It was built by the Emperor Hadrian in the year 136 AD, because pilgrims had been coming to that site and had been elevating as the site of Jesus' tomb and a place of his resurrection. Hadrian, in an attempt to erase the name and memory of Christ, if that were possible, built a pagan shrine over the site. Now, Constantine tears down the pagan shrine in order to discover whether tradition is true, whether the stories are true, that the first century graves of Jesus and Joseph of Arimathea are in this area. And this is what he finds. Now, this is what the site would have looked like in the first century. It would have had tombs on the left. Those are new tombs, we know from the story. And then over to the right, a hill that we know of as Calvary. Now, in the 8th century BC, they are using this site as a quarry, a stone quarry, in order to get building materials for buildings that are going up. But it is filled in by the first century with gravel and other rubble. On top had been laid a nice ground soil. So in the first century BC to the first century AD, what you have here is some new tombs, and you have a garden area. Now, upon discovering this area and the first century tombs that indeed did go with tradition, when they dug down, removing that shrine and dug down, they found these first century tombs just as the Christians said they would. And so they built a church over the site in 326 AD. And what you're seeing now is a picture of the outline of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which has undergone many renovations over the years. But this is the basic outline as you'll find it today. On one side of the church, you'll see a covering over the tomb of Jesus. On the other side of the church, in fact, where you saw walking in those main doors, if you walk in those doors and directly to your right, you see a set of stairs. You walk up those stairs, and what you're going to find is that you're climbing the hill of Calvary. And upstairs, you'll find a number of altars, and you'll see a line. You'll get in that line. You'll see people going, and beneath one of the altars, they're putting their hands inside of a hole and touching something, and that something is the top of the stone hill of Calvary, where it's believed the cross was implanted. And you'll touch that stone, and then you'll go back down a set of stairs into the main area, cross the other side of the church, and you'll see a building within a building. And inside of that building, that smaller building, is the tomb of Christ. Now, don't just go to the tomb of Christ, but go around back of that building on the far side of the wall, and you'll see original first century tombs as they were in the first century. And these are known as the tombs of Joseph of Arimathea. They are just feet away from the tomb of Christ. So this was one large tomb complex in the first century. Now, in verse 5, John says that he bent over and looked inside. And that's because the tomb entrance is always lower than a typical doorway would be. Here's a picture of a first century tomb entrance. It's a rolling stone tomb entrance, by the way. And the picture's a little bit deceiving. You don't have to crawl to get inside. It is actually tall enough to bend and to be able to walk inside. But just as a note to how rare these rolling stone tombs are. I mean, they're the kind of tombs with a rolling stone that only the wealthy have. And we know that this is indeed the case, that Jesus was buried with the rich, as the Old Testament said that the despised servant would be. And that's because it was a rich man's tomb named Joseph of Arimathea, although it had never yet been used. A Biblical Archaeological Society tells us that of the more than 900 burial caves from the Second Temple period found in and around Jerusalem, only 4 are known to have used round, disc-shaped blocking stones. So that tells you how rare these are. You can actually see a couple of these yet in Jerusalem and the surrounding area today. Here's an example of inside a first century tomb. This is a rolling stone tomb example. You go inside and you see a depression in the floor. This is actually a rather large depression. In a lot of tombs, there's a smaller depression, just enough to fit 1 or 2 people so that they can stand up in the tomb area and be able to sing the psalms and to give prayers. On the right-hand side, you see a shrouded body that has been laid out for burial. It is laid out to dry. The Jewish folks would lay out the body for about a year until all of the flesh had decayed off of the bones, and then they would take the bones and they would gather them together and put them in these ossuaries that are there, or bone boxes. And this is what the Old Testament means when it says, and they gathered his bones together with the bones of his fathers. Because in these ossuaries, it wasn't just one set of bones, but the bones of 2 or 3 or 4 individuals could fit inside of these ossuaries. What you see around the back are the niches where other bodies could be laid. It's because these were family tombs, and sometimes more than one body would be needed to laid out at a time over the course of a year as the bodies decayed. But of course, we know that in Jesus' tomb that he was laid in, only his body was there because it was a new tomb that had never yet been used. Now, the disciples are surprised both by what they find and by what they don't find in the tomb. What they don't find, of course, is Jesus' body. But what they do find is something significant enough to make John believe. Verse 8, finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went inside. He saw and believed. What did he see that made the light go on for him? The passage describes it, verse 6 and following. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the burial cloth that had been around Jesus' head. The cloth was folded up by itself, separate from the linen. So what is it about the grave clothes that were laid out that made John believe? Well, there's this wonderful, deeply moving story that helps us to connect some of these pieces. I'd like to read that story for you. In order to understand the significance of the folded napkin, we need to understand a little bit about Hebrew tradition of that day. The folded napkin had to do with the master and servant, and every Jewish boy knew this tradition. When the servant set the dinner table for the master, he made sure that it was exactly the way the master wanted it. The table was furnished perfectly, and then the servant would wait just outside of sight until the master had finished eating. The servant would not dare touch the table until the master was finished. Now, if the master was finished eating, he would rise from the table, wipe his fingers and mouth, and clean his beard, and wad up the napkin and toss it on the table. The servant would then know to clear the table, for in those days, the wadded napkin meant, I'm finished. But if the master got up from the table, folded his napkin, and laid it beside his plate, the servant would not dare touch the table, because the folded napkin meant, I'm coming back. Let us be reminded daily during this post-Easter season, Jesus Christ is not finished. He is coming back for his faithful servants within his church. Man, now that is a powerful illustration. And if it had any historical validity, it would be even more powerful. But unfortunately, folding the napkin and setting it inside one's plate was not a first century Jewish custom. So we don't know where this story came from, or there's certainly no historical evidence for anything like that. And even though it's said every Jewish boy knows this tradition, if you ask a Jewish boy anywhere, in Jerusalem or wherever they might reside, no Jewish boy will know of this tradition, because in the first century, Jewish folks didn't even use napkins. Right? That's more of a European thing. That's something that comes way later. So a great story which would help explain this if only it were historically accurate. So if that doesn't explain it, then what does? What does John see that makes him believe? Well, because it's not something that we're accustomed to, it's something that we could easily overlook. But anyone who was used to burying bodies or wrapping them in burial cloths in the first century would have noticed. First is the fact that the grave clothes were there at all. I mean, Jesus was definitely dead. Romans knew how to kill people, and they knew how to make sure they were dead before they took them off the cross and let the body go to someone for burial. Now, if someone moved the body, they certainly wouldn't have taken time to remove the burial cloths. Now remember, this is a pretty tedious, tight wrapping that included spices being wrapped around with the body. It would have been tedious to remove it. Keener says, had someone moved the body, they would have moved it in its wrappings. Had tomb robbers, rare in Judea, left the wrappings, they would have left them in disarray and likely left the body with it. Whoever left the wrappings, by contrast, left them there neatly. The face cloth may not be merely separate, as the NIV translates it, or folded up, as the ESV translates, but wrapped or rolled up. Again, this could be an indication of neatness, but scholars suggest that it was still rolled the way that it had been when it was wrapped around Jesus' head. That is, his body had risen straight out of the wrappings and the cloth. What made John see and believe? Likely that the grave clothes were missing a body, and yet they still appeared to be unwrapped. That would have been very strange indeed. Finally, we come back to verse 1. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. What day of the week is it? The first day of the week, it tells us. Well, what day of the week is the first day? Well, we know from Jewish traditions, right? From Genesis. We know that the seventh day of the week is the day that God rested, and he called it the Sabbath, and Jewish folks observe it as the Sabbath even today. And what day does that land on? Saturday. The Jewish Saturday, anyhow. The Jewish Saturday begins at sundown on our Friday evening and goes to sundown on our Saturday evening. That's Saturday. So at the beginning of the new day, or the first day of the week, is the day that follows, and it's the same first day of the week as it is for us. Sunday is the first day of the week. And that's why Christians worship on Sunday, the first day of the week. Why does it matter? Why do Christians worship on Sunday rather than Sabbath? I mean, you would think that since the Christians were originally Jewish Christians, that's how Christianity started, with a group of Jewish folks, that they would have worshipped on the Sabbath, on Saturday. It would have been natural. But they worship on Sunday. Pretty much the church worldwide worships on a Sunday, with very few exceptions. Why is that? Because there's this theological significance to it. Jesus' resurrection was on the first day of the week, and it signified the beginning of the new creation. He is the beginning of God's new world. I love the way N.T. Wright contrasts Genesis chapter 1 and the creation, the darkness and then the light, with Jesus' being laid in the dark tomb and the light that came with the resurrection and the open tomb. So I'm going to quote him at length here. He says, "Darkness on the face of the deep, the formless beginning, the chaos, the void, the beginning, the wind and the word, God's breath, God's speech, summoning things never known before, life and light, the first day, creation. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word became flesh. The flesh has spoken, breathed, brought life and light. New creation has spilled out around him wherever he has gone. Here's the man, the sixth day. Creation is complete. God saw all he had made, and it was very good. Flesh dies. Chaos comes again. Darkness descends on the little weeping group at the cross. Two men in the fading light do what has to be done. Then the long Sabbath, the rest in the cold tomb. Peter, out of breath, arrives at the tomb a few moments after John. He acts in character. No waiting, no beating around the bush, no shall we or shan't we. He goes in. And here's an even more curious thing. The linen cloths are lying there, but the single cloth, the napkin that had been around Jesus' head, isn't with the others. It's in a place by itself. Someone, having unwrapped the body, a complicated task in itself, has gone to the trouble of laying out the clothes to create an effect. It looks as though the body wasn't picked up and unwrapped, but had just disappeared, leaving the empty cloths like a collapsed balloon when the air has gone out of it. John saw and believed. What did he believe? He believed that with the resurrection, that the new creation had begun. He believed that the world had turned a corner out of its long winter and finally come into its spring at last. He believed that God had said yes to Jesus and all that Jesus had done. He believed that Jesus was alive again. How else could you explain the clothes that were still wrapped? If you ask around the world today what people think the biggest day of the year is for Christians, most people are going to say Christmas. But you know that they don't actually know what time of year Jesus was born, except for that it probably wasn't December. How do they know that? Because the text says that the shepherds were out in the field at night. Do you know what shepherds don't do at night in December? Stay out in the fields. Because even in Israel, it's pretty cold, so they take the sheep in. But that's not the important part. The reality is that Easter is the most important day for Christians, because this is the moment when the new creation begins. If it hadn't been for Easter, no one would have even have thought of celebrating Christmas. This is the first day of God's new week. The stone has been rolled away. The darkness has gone, and the sun is shining.
Living with uncertainty can take its toll. The normal day-to-day is replaced with fear, worry, doubt. When our normal is disrupted, our surroundings begin to feel weak. Foundations begin to rattle. Our lives become disoriented. As time goes on, we begin to lose sight of the one constant on our journey: Jesus. The fear is consuming, the worry draining, the doubt painful. Even in our darkest moments, when the last thread of hope has unraveled from our being, we must dwell on truth. We must remember, no matter what is happening around us, God is still sovereign. Today, let us dwell on the truth of Easter. The stone has been rolled away. The grave has been rendered powerless. Death has transformed to life. In our fear, He is still risen. In our worry, He is still victorious. In our doubt, He is still alive. When everything seems hopeless, the hope of Easter remains.